The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of endings. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated the tongue, settled in the lungs, and clung to hope until it choked. Ruth Bennett knew the taste well. It was the taste of the trail of shallow graves and whispered goodbyes. She had stopped in this forgotten town for supplies, a brief pause in a long journey away from a life that no longer existed. She was standing outside the general store, debating the wisdom of spending her last few coins on a bag of flour when the world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire and splintering wood. Chaos erupted from the bank across the street. Men shouted, horses screamed, and the lazy afternoon air was torn apart by the sharp crack of rifles. People scrambled for cover, their faces masks of panic. Ruth was thrown back against the rough-hewn planks of the store as a panicked townsman shoved past her. Her instincts, honed by years of quiet resilience, took over. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She watched her body pressed flat against the wall, her gaze sharp and assessing. 4 riders, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, burst from the bank canvas sacks slung over their shoulders. They fired wildly into the air, their shots punctuating the terrified silence that had fallen over the street. A lone lawman, a man with more courage than sense, emerged from his office, his revolver drawn. His first shot went wide. Theirs did not. He crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The lead robber, a tall man with a cruel confidence in his posture, swung a leg over his horse. He was about to spur the animal into a gallop when another shot rang out, this one from the second-story window of the saloon. The robber grunted, his body seizing. He clutched at his side, his eyes wide with surprise. And as he slumped forward against his horse's neck, something small and silver slipped from his grasp. It fell into the thick dust of the street, glinting once in the harsh sunlight before being obscured. His men, seeing their leader hit, returned fire toward the window before grabbing his horse's reins and dragging him along as they thundered out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and fear in their wake. The street was still for a long moment, the silence broken only by the whimpering of the wounded and the frantic neighing of a tethered horse. Then slowly people began to emerge from their hiding places. Ruth remained pressed against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her eyes were fixed on the spot in the dust where the silver object had fallen. No one else seemed to have noticed it. They were all gathered around the fallen lawman, their voices a low, mournful murmur. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, Ruth pushed herself off the wall. She walked with a steady, deliberate pace into the middle of the street, her worn boots making no sound in the thick dust. She knelt, her fingers searching the gritty earth, until they closed around a cool metallic shape. It was a locket. A heavy silver locket tarnished with age and intricately engraved with a familiar pattern of twisting vines and a single stylized rose. Her breath hitched in her throat. She stood brushing the dust from its surface with a trembling thumb. It was impossible. She knew this design. She knew the weight of it, the satisfying click of its clasp. It was a family heirloom passed down through her husband's family for generations. A unique piece crafted by a great-grandfather in the old country. The one she had placed in her husband William's hands as he lay in his coffin, a final token of a love cut short by fever. The one she believed was buried 6 feet under the cold soil of a world she had left behind forever. Her blood ran cold. With shaking fingers she fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open. Inside, nestled against the worn velvet, was not the miniature portrait of her own face that had once been there. Instead, it was a tiny, hand-tinted photograph of a woman she had never seen before. A woman with dark, sorrowful eyes and a gentle, sad smile. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Ruth stared at the face of the stranger, her mind reeling. Who was this bank robber? Who was this woman? And how in God's name did a violent outlaw in a dusty town called Redemption Gulch come to possess the locket she had buried with her husband? The shocking mystery fell upon her like a shroud. A chilling premonition that the past she was so desperately trying to outrun was not behind her at all. It was waiting for her, just up the trail. Ruth's journey west had been born not of hope, but of exorcism. She was not seeking a new life, but fleeing the ghost of an old one. Every sunrise was a reminder of the morning she had woken to find her daughter Clara burning with a fever that would claim her by dusk. Every sunset was an echo of the evening William had succumbed to the same sickness, his hand growing cold in hers. The fever had swept through their small community like a phantom scythe, leaving a trail of fresh graves and hollowed-out families. For Ruth, it had taken everything. She sold their small farm, the land they had poured their youth into, for a pittance. She packed a single satchel with a change of clothes, her skillet, and a worn Bible, whose promises of comfort now felt like cruel jokes. Her grief was a physical presence, a quiet, heavy passenger that sat beside her on the stagecoach, its weight pressing the air from her lungs. She had become wary, her heart barricaded against the possibility of new attachments. To love was to lose, and she had no more to give. Her journey was a penance, a pilgrimage through the vast, unforgiving landscapes of the West, seeking a place where she could be useful without being known, where she could work until exhaustion silenced the memories that screamed in the quiet of the night. The silver locket was a brand on her soul. She kept it tucked in a small leather pouch pinned to the inside of her dress, its cold weight a constant, terrifying reminder. The outlaws could return for it. They might think she had witnessed something that she could identify them. The mystery of it was a maddening puzzle. William had been a good man, a simple farmer. He had no secrets, no connection to the violent world of outlaws and stolen money. Yet the proof lay against her skin, a cold, hard piece of an impossible truth. Her meager savings were dwindling. She needed work, a place to anchor herself before the trail swallowed her whole. In a town 2 days' ride from Redemption Gulch, she saw a notice tacked to the post office door * cook wanted. Hollow Creek Ranch. Inquire with Amos Cartwright. The name meant nothing to her, but the work was honest. It was a roof and a wage. It was a reason to stop moving. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, was happy to share what he knew. Amos Cartwright, hard man. Hard as this land, he'd said, spitting a brown stream into the dust. Lost his wife Martha to the fever a year or so back. Good woman she was. The heart of that place. Since she's been gone, Cartwright's closed himself off, pushing everyone away. Got 2 little ones, a girl and a boy. Tough life for them growing up in the shadow of a ghost. The description did not deter Ruth. A man walled off by grief was a man who wouldn't ask questions. He wouldn't pry into her past or expect warmth she no longer possessed. He needed a cook. She needed a wage. The arrangement felt clean, simple. It was a final, desperate attempt to find stable ground before she was swept away completely. The wagon that took her the final leg to Hollow Creek left her at the bottom of a long, dusty lane. The ranch house sat on a low rise, a simple, sturdy structure of dark wood, flanked by a large barn and a series of corrals. It looked solid but lonely, as if it were holding its breath against the vast, empty sky. As Ruth walked the cracked path toward the front porch, the locket felt heavy against her chest, a secret she carried into a house already burdened with its own. The man who answered her knock filled the doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of hard lines and weary resignation. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, were guarded and cold. He looked like a man who had been in a fight with the world for a very long time and had no intention of surrendering, even if he was losing. "Mr. Cartwright," she said, her voice steady. He gave a single sharp nod. "You're the cook." It wasn't a question. Ruth mirrored his nod. The words from her original plan and the ones that had seemed so simple now felt like a lie she was telling herself. "Just here to cook. That's all." He stepped aside without a word of welcome, his silence a palpable thing. The door creaked open just wide enough for her to pass. As Ruth stepped over the threshold, she was met not by warmth, but by the chilling presence of a grief as profound and suffocating as her own. The air was thick with it. The sparse furniture, the bare walls, the table set for a family that was no longer whole, it was a museum of loss. The scent of dust and old sorrows hung in the air. And then she saw them. Two small figures half hidden in the shadows of a hallway, their eyes wide and watchful. They were like frightened fawns poised to bolt at the slightest sound. The girl, who looked to be about 8, had straight dark hair and a weary solemnity that didn't belong on a child's face. She stepped forward first, her small hands clasped in front of her. "I'm Rose," she announced, her voice a fragile attempt at bravery. "That's Thomas." The boy, no older than 5, clutched at his sister's skirt, peeking around her with wide, fearful eyes. Ruth felt a painful tug in her chest, a phantom ache for the daughter she had lost. She knelt, forcing a gentle smile she didn't feel. "It's a kindness to meet you both." Rose squinted, her gaze unnervingly direct. "Are you going to be our new mama?" The question, so innocent and yet so loaded, struck Ruth like a physical blow. She was here to escape connection, to avoid the very possibility of another heart-wrenching loss. Before she could form a reply, Amos Cartwright's voice cut through the stillness, as sharp and cold as a winter wind. "No, she's just here to cook." The hope in Rose's eyes flickered and died. Her small shoulders slumped in defeat. Thomas said nothing, simply staring at Ruth with a profound, silent disappointment, before backing away down the hall, pulling his sister with him. Ruth straightened her own carefully constructed walls, reinforcing themselves. She glanced at the man whose grief mirrored her own, but whose hardness felt like a deliberate weapon. The coldness in this house was more than just sorrow. It was a fortress. And as she looked at Amos's shuttered face, the mystery of the locket felt suddenly more dangerous. A man this guarded a house, this steeped in secrets. What other darkness was hidden here at Hollow Creek? The first obstacle was the silence. It was a living entity in the Cartwright house, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from grief and mistrust. Amos moved through it like a ghost in his own home, his footsteps heavy, his words clipped and infrequent. His silence wasn't empty. It was a wall, and Ruth spent her first days navigating its perimeter, unsure how to breach it. The children, Rose and Thomas, were no easier. They orbited her like wary satellites, their behavior swinging between defiant outbursts and complete, unnerving withdrawal. Rose would test her, deliberately spilling a glass of milk and watching with narrowed eyes to gauge her reaction. Thomas would simply retreat, hiding behind furniture and refusing to speak for hours at a time. Ruth knew this battlefield. It was the landscape of a broken heart. She didn't push, she didn't pry. She fought back with the only weapons she had left: patience and purpose. She won her first small victory, not with words, but with cornbread. She baked it in her own cast-iron skillet, and the one she'd carried across the country. And the warm, comforting scent was the first thing to truly permeate the house's stale air of sorrow. The children ate it slowly, their suspicion warring with their hunger. When Thomas, his cheeks dusted with crumbs, looked up at her and whispered, "It's good," it felt like the first ray of sun after a long winter. Slowly, she began to carve out a space for herself. She learned the stove's temperamental nature, the way the floorboards creaked outside the children's room. She learned that Amos drank his coffee black and bitter, and that Rose secretly loved the smell of cinnamon. These small intimacies were footholds in the sheer cliff face of their collective grief. All the while, the locket remained a cold weight against her skin, a constant nagging mystery. The fear that the outlaws might track her down, believing she was a witness, or that the locket held some key, was a low hum beneath the surface of her days. She needed answers, But in a place this isolated information was a rare commodity. She began her investigation, cautiously planting seeds of conversation like a careful gardener. Her first target was Jed, the old ranch hand. He was a stooped, wiry man with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that had seen more seasons than the ancient cottonwoods by the creek. She'd find him in the barn, mending tack or sharpening tools. "It's a quiet place, Hollow Creek," she commented one afternoon, offering him a cup of hot coffee. Jed grunted, not looking up from the bridle he was oiling. "Always has been. Except when Martha was alive." She could make a fence post laugh. "I'm sure she was a wonderful woman," Ruth said softly. "Mr. Cartwright must have loved her very much. Like the sun loves the sky," Jed said, finally pausing. He took the coffee. "That's the trouble. When the sun goes out, it gets mighty dark. Mighty cold." "Were there many visitors back then?" Family Ruth asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Jed shook his head. "Martha's people were back east. Had a sister she wrote to, but they weren't close. And a brother, a wild one. Silas. Caused nothing but trouble. Martha loved him, but she feared him too. Haven't seen or heard from him in years. Good riddance, I say." The name Silas lodged in her mind. A wild brother? A potential connection to a world of violence. Her next opportunity came during her weekly trip to town for supplies. Mrs. Henley, the pastor's wife, a round, bustling woman with a kind heart and an insatiable appetite for news, ran the small church charity box. Ruth made a small donation. "It's so good to see some life returning to the Cartwright place," Mrs. Henley chirped, folding Ruth's coins into a cloth bag. "Those poor children. And Amos so lost without his Martha. It's a house that needs healing." Ruth agreed. "I was just wondering. Mrs. Henley, has there been much trouble in these parts lately? Strangers passing through? I was in Redemption Gulch during that awful bank robbery." Mrs. Henley's eyes widened. "Oh, you poor dear, that was terrible." "The sheriff from the next county came through asking questions. Said the men were professionals, part of a gang that's been hitting towns all along the rail line. Said their leader was a smart, vicious man. No one's seen them since." Ruth's blood ran cold. A professional gang. A vicious leader. Could a man like that have some hidden connection to her gentle husband, William? It made no sense. As the weeks passed, Ruth's presence began to work a subtle alchemy on the household. One afternoon, while kneading dough, she began to hum an old lullaby, one she used to sing to Clara. She stopped abruptly, the memory a sudden, sharp pain. From the doorway, a small voice said, "Don't stop." It was Rose. "It's pretty." Ruth swallowed the lump in her throat and began to hum again, her hands moving in rhythm with the melody. Rose came and stood beside her, watching her expression softer for the first time. The real shift came with the arrival of the wagon. It appeared one evening as a silhouette against the setting sun, a single, exhausted horse pulling a dilapidated cart. A man named Clyde, his face a mask of desperation, asked for water and a place to rest. In the back of the wagon, under a thin blanket, lay his nephew Jacob, a boy as small and silent as Thomas had been, his eyes vacant with trauma. Clyde spun a tale of losing his brother to fever, of a boy left mute by grief. Amos, his own wounds still fresh, was ready to send them away. "We're not a charity," he said, his voice hard. But Ruth saw the boy, and in him she saw her own loss and the universal fragility of childhood. "He's just a child, Amos," she said, her voice low but firm. "We have a warm barn and enough stew for 2 more. We don't turn away the afflicted." Her resolve, born of a deeper understanding of suffering, chipped away at his armor. He relented. Ruth cared for the boy, coaxing him with warm milk and gentle words. Thomas, seeing a sorrow that mirrored his own, was the one who finally broke through Jacob's silence, offering him a carved wooden horse without a word. The 2 boys sat in the dust behind the barn, a silent communion of the lost. The presence of other travelers, other sorrows, seemed to dilute the concentrated grief in the Cartwright house. For the first time, Amos, Ruth, and the children were a unit allied in an act of compassion. When Amos found Clyde trying to fix a broken wagon wheel and without a word took the tools and finished the job himself, Ruth knew a corner had been turned. The wall of his silence was still there, but he had just opened a gate. As the days wore on, Ruth's quiet empathy had its effect on the family. She was no longer just the cook. She was the steady hand that bandaged a scraped knee, the calm voice that soothed a nightmare, the quiet presence that made the long evenings feel less empty. Amos began to linger in the kitchen after the children were asleep, not speaking, but sharing the silence with her, a silence that was slowly transforming from a barrier into a form of communion. The children no longer tested her. They sought her out. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Thomas crawled into her lap while she mended a shirt. Rose leaned against her chair, tracing patterns on the floorboards. It was in that moment of fragile peace that Rose looked up and asked again, her voice soft and hopeful, "Are you going to stay forever?" This time, before Ruth could answer, Amos spoke from the shadows by the hearth. "I reckon that's up to her." His words, a quiet admission of need, hung in the air. Ruth looked from the children's hopeful faces to the man in the shadows, and for the first time since William's death, she felt the terrifying, undeniable pull of a life she might want to claim as her own. But even as this new warmth spread through her, the cold weight of the locket was a chilling reminder that another more dangerous story was unfolding its threads, drawing ever closer to Hollow Creek. The thaw at Hollow Creek was as gradual as the coming of spring. First came the small signs. Amos began leaving his muddy boots on the porch, without being asked, a silent acknowledgement that he now considered the cleanliness of her floors. Rose started bringing her wildflowers she'd picked by the creek, laying them on the kitchen windowsill in a chipped mason jar. Thomas, once a shadow, became her constant companion, his small hand often finding its way into hers. Ruth, in turn, began to let her guard down. She found herself laughing at Thomas's antics, sharing quiet moments of understanding with Rose, and even meeting Amos's gaze across the dinner table without immediately looking away. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a stranger. He rode in one bright afternoon on a handsome sorrel, looking less like a wanderer and more like a man who owned any ground he stood on. He was tall and well-dressed, with a charismatic smile that seemed to charm the very air around him. He dismounted with an easy grace and introduced himself to Amos as a land surveyor sent by the territorial government to chart the outer boundaries of the valley. "Name's Silas," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to take in everything at once, the state of the barn and the number of cattle in the corral, or the woman standing quietly on the porch. Ruth felt an immediate primal distrust. It was a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. His charm felt manufactured, his smile a well-rehearsed performance. The name Silas echoed in her mind. Martha's wild brother. Jed's words came back to her, and she watched the man with a new sharp-edged suspicion. Amos, ever cautious, was reserved, but polite. He offered the man a meal and a place in the bunkhouse for the night. Over dinner, Silas was captivating. He told stories of his travels of booming cities in the east and untamed wilderness in the north. He praised Ruth's cooking, charmed Rose with a question about her favorite book, and even managed to coax a shy smile from Thomas. He directed most of his attention, however, to Amos asking seemingly innocent questions about the ranch. "This is impressive land, Cartwright," Silas said, leaning back in his chair. "Must be hard work for one man. How many hands you keep?" "Enough," Amos answered, his voice flat. "And the water rights from this creek must be valuable. Anyone ever challenge you on them?" Ruth watched the exchange, her unease growing. Silas's questions were like a surgeon's probes, searching for weaknesses. His watchfulness was predatory. While he spoke to Amos, his eyes would dart around the room, cataloging every detail. The next day, Silas began his surveying. He rode the perimeter of the ranch, a leather-bound notebook in hand. But Ruth noticed he spent more time talking to the ranch hands than measuring fence lines. She saw him sharing a flask with two of the younger men, laughing and slapping their backs. By evening, a subtle poison had begun to seep into the ranch's atmosphere. The hands were quieter, their glances towards Amos more hesitant. Silas was subtly undermining him, planting seeds of doubt about his leadership, his solvency, his future. Her own investigation intensified. That night, after the children were asleep, Ruth finally found the courage to search for more clues. She remembered Jed mentioning that Martha was a letter writer. Where would a woman keep her most private thoughts? Not in the main room, not in the cold master bedroom. She tried a small, dusty storeroom at the back of the house, filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings. Tucked away in a small sewing basket under a pile of old linens, she found it a wooden box tied with a faded ribbon. Inside were Martha's letters. Most were from her sister, filled with trivial family gossip. But at the very bottom was a small bundled stack, written in Martha's own hand, but never sent. They were addressed to her brother Silas. Ruth's hands trembled as she read them. Asterisk, dearest Silas. Asterisk 1 began asterisk. You cannot come here. Amos is a good man, but he does not understand the life you have chosen. Your presence would bring nothing but danger to this family, to my children. I pray for you, but you must stay away. Another was more desperate. Asterisk Silas, the men you associate with are animals. What they did in that town, I read about it in the paper. If you have any love for me left in your heart, you will turn from this path. This ranch is a place of peace. Your world has no place here. The final letter was chilling. Asterisk, I fear you, Silas. I fear the darkness you carry with you. It is a sickness, and I am afraid it will one day consume you entirely. Ruth sat on the dusty floor, the letters spread around her, her heart pounding. This was him. The charismatic surveyor was Martha's estranged, volatile brother. The brother she feared. A man connected to a world of violence. A terrible, sickening thought began to form in her mind. She thought of the bank robbery, the locket, the unknown woman's portrait. Could there be a connection? Her suspicions were confirmed 2 days later. Silas finished his survey and announced he would be riding into town. The next evening, he returned, but he was not alone. He was accompanied by the county sheriff and a slick-looking lawyer from Dawson City. Amos met them on the porch, his face grim. Ruth stood in the doorway, the box of letters hidden in her apron pocket. What is this? Amos demanded. Silas's charming smile was gone, replaced by a cold, triumphant smirk. This, Amos, is a reckoning. He gestured to the lawyer, who stepped forward and handed Amos a sheaf of legal papers. My name is Silas Miller. Martha was my sister. Amos stared at him, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning fury. These documents, the lawyer said in a dry, reedy voice, constitute a legal claim on this property. Mr. Miller, as Martha's sole surviving blood relative besides her children, is asserting his right to his sister's share of the Hollow Creek Ranch. Martha has no share, Amos growled. This land is mine. Not according to the territorial inheritance laws, Silas cut in, his voice dripping with venom. But this isn't just about land. It's about justice. It's about your negligence. Negligence that led directly to my sister's death. The accusation hung in the air, stunning Amos into silence. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? Amos Silas sneered, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for all to hear. The week she fell ill, the whole valley knew she was sick. But where were you? You were in Dawson chasing some business deal, trying to buy up more acreage while your wife lay dying. You left her alone. You left her vulnerable and alone. And because of your greed, she died. Her death is on your hands. The accusation struck Amos like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face ashen. A deep, secret well of guilt Ruth had only ever sensed in him now burst forth visible in the tremor of his hands and the raw agony in his eyes. This was the burden he carried. This was the source of his impenetrable walls. The conflict was no longer about property. It was about Amos's soul. It was an attack on his honor, his love for his wife, his fitness as a father. As Silas watched Amos crumble, his triumphant gaze swept over the ranch he now believed was his. Ruth saw it then, the connection that sealed her terror. Hanging from Silas's saddle was a small leather pouch, identical to the one worn by the bank robber who had been shot in Redemption Gulch. The man who dropped her husband's locket was one of Silas's men, and Silas, the grieving brother, was the leader of the gang. He wasn't just using the law as a weapon. It was merely the opening salvo in a war he intended to win with violence. Silas's accusation shattered the fragile peace of Hollow Creek, and its shards cut deep into Amos. The public revelation of his deepest guilt sent him spiraling back into the silent, unreachable man he had been when Ruth first arrived. He retreated behind his walls, but this time they were fortified with shame. He spent his days staring out at the land. He was about to lose his nights, sitting by the cold hearth, a ghost haunted by his own choices. He spoke to no one, his eyes holding a bleak, hollowed-out look that frightened the children and broke Ruth's heart. He planned to fight Silas, legally hiring a lawyer from a neighboring town, but his spirit was gone. He was emotionally paralyzed, already defeated. The poison Silas had so carefully spread began to take root. His cunning narrative, that of a concerned brother seeking justice for a sister abandoned by her greedy husband, was tragically effective. When Amos went to the general store, his credit was politely but firmly refused. The storekeeper, a man he'd known for 20 years, couldn't meet his eyes. "Just until this business with the court is settled, Amos. You understand." Ranch hands loyal for years began to drift away, intimidated by quiet threats from Silas's men who now lingered in town like vultures. The Cartwright family was being isolated, choked off from the community that had once been their foundation. Ruth refused to surrender. She became the ranch's fierce, unyielding heart. She fought for every scrap of normalcy, ensuring the children's routines remained, that the bread was always baked, that the house remained a sanctuary, even as the world outside turned against them. But her greatest battle was for Amos's spirit. One evening, after the children were asleep, she found him in the barn, staring at Martha's old saddle, which still hung on a wooden rack. His shoulders were slumped in utter defeat. "She's right, you know," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I wasn't here." Ruth stood behind him, her voice firm. "You are here now, Amos. That is what matters." "I left her," he said, turning to face her, his eyes filled with a pain so raw it was difficult to look at. "She told me not to go. She said she felt unwell, but I thought it was just a chill. The deal in Dawson, it was for the parcel of land upstream. It would have guaranteed our water rights forever. It was for her, for the children. I told myself it was for them." He shook his head, his voice cracking. "I came back 2 days later, and she was gone. I traded my wife for a piece of dirt." The confession, choked with years of self-loathing, filled the space between them. Ruth stepped forward, her hands closing over his. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "You made a mistake. A human mistake born of love and a desire to protect your family. You did not abandon her. Guilt is the weapon Silas is using against you because he knows it's the only one that can defeat you. Don't let him." "How do I fight a ghost?" he whispered. "With the truth," she answered. "We have to find the truth." She led him back to the house, to the box of Martha's unsent letters to Silas. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm circle of light in the darkened room, and read through them again, searching for anything they might have missed. Amos's hands shook as he held the pages his wife had touched. She feared him, Amos murmured, reading a passage aloud. Asterisk. Your world has no place here. She was protecting you, Amos, Ruth said. Protecting the family from him. Then, in the very last letter, the one that spoke of the darkness Silas carried, Ruth found it. A single line tucked away at the end of a paragraph that she had previously skimmed over. Asterisk. I know you believe you are owed something for what happened to Father Asterisk. Martha had written asterisk, but your quest for revenge will only lead you to ruin. I have made my peace with the past. For my sake, and for the sake of your own soul, I pray you do the same. Amos looked up, his eyes wide. Her father? Her father lost his farm years ago. He invested everything in a railroad scheme that went bust. He blamed his partner, a man who pulled out at the last minute. He died a broken, bitter man. Silas swore he'd get revenge on that partner and his family, no matter how long it took. Ruth's mind raced. Amos? What was the partner's name? I don't remember the last name, he said, frowning in concentration. Just the first. It was William. The room fell silent. William, the name of Ruth's late husband. My husband, Ruth, whispered, her blood turning to ice. My husband's father was a railroad investor. He pulled out of a partnership that failed. He said his partner was reckless, that he saved their family from ruin. Amos stared at her, the pieces of the impossible puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Silas. He wasn't just robbing a random bank in Redemption Gulch. No, Ruth said, her voice trembling as she pulled the locket from the pouch inside her dress and placed it on the table between them. He was robbing Asterisk, my Asterisk bank. The bank where my husband's family held their accounts. The man who was shot, his accomplice. He must have stolen the locket from my husband's grave on Silas's orders. The portrait inside was not of Silas's lover or some unknown woman. It was a picture of Martha. Silas had put his sister's picture inside a locket stolen from the grave of the man he blamed for his family's ruin. It was a twisted, symbolic act of vengeance. His entire vendetta wasn't just against Amos for Martha's death. It was a multi-generational war against Ruth's family. They were not two separate stories. They were one. This revelation, as horrific as it was also a beacon. It changed everything. Silas's motivation was not grief. It was a cold, calculated, long-simmering hatred. And Amos's guilt, the linchpin of Silas's entire plan, was no longer the central issue. It was a lie, a tool being used by a monster. Amos looked from the locket to Ruth, his eyes clearing for the first time in days. The paralysis was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. His fight was no longer just for his land or his honor. It was for Ruth. It was for the family they had built together, a family that had been targeted by a madman's ghost. Their bond, forged in shared loss, was now solidified in a shared fight for survival. The sandstorm arrived without warning, a monstrous roiling wall of brown that blotted out the sun and descended upon the valley like a biblical plague. The wind howled a symphony of shrieks and moans that rattled the windows and tore at the very foundations of the house. It was the perfect cover for an attack. The world was reduced to the four walls of the ranch house, isolated, blind, and deafened by the storm's fury. Inside, there was a tense, focused calm. Jed had arrived from the bunkhouse just before the storm hit, his old rifle clutched in his gnarled hands. Felt it in my bones, he'd muttered. This ain't just weather. Amos had bolted the doors and shuttered the windows. The house was plunged into a dim, claustrophobic twilight, lit only by a few flickering lanterns that cast long, dancing shadows. He gathered Rose and Thomas, his voice low and steady. I need you to be brave. You're going to play a hiding game in the root cellar. Ruth will be with you. No matter what you hear, you do not come out until I open the door myself. Do you understand? The children, their faces pale but their eyes wide with trust, nodded solemnly. Ruth led them to the small trapdoor in the kitchen floor, settling them on a pile of old blankets with a single lantern. "I will be right back," she promised, kissing each of them on the forehead. "Stay here, be quiet, and pray." She emerged from the cellar, her face set. In her hands was not a weapon, but the silver locket. It was her truth, her connection to this fight. She found Amos and Jed by the front door, rifles ready. "They're here," Amos said, his voice barely a whisper above the roar of the wind. The first blow came against the back door, a heavy, splintering thud. Then another. They weren't trying to be subtle. This was not about seizure. It was about annihilation. A window in the main room shattered, and the storm surged inside, sending lanterns swinging wildly and papers flying. A figure scrambled through the broken window, then another. Amos fired. One of the men crumpled to the floor. Jed's rifle cracked from the hallway, and the second intruder fell back with a cry. The gunfight was a chaotic, deafening affair inside the dimly lit house. Gunsmoke mixed with the dust from the storm, burning their eyes and throats. The howling wind outside was punctuated by the sharp retort of gunfire and the crash of overturning furniture. Under the cover of the noise, 2 more of Silas's men forced the front door. Amos was pinned down behind the heavy dining table. Jed was reloading. Ruth, seeing Amos's predicament, acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and with a guttural cry swung it with all her might at the man nearest the door. The blow connected with his shoulder, sending him staggering back into his partner, giving Amos the split second he needed. His rifle roared, and both men went down. A sudden, eerie silence fell, broken only by the screaming wind. It was a lull in the fighting. "That's all of them," Jed panted, leaning against the wall. "No," Amos said, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Not all of them." From the darkened hallway leading to the bedrooms, a figure emerged. It was Silas, a revolver in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. His clothes were torn, his hair wild, but his eyes burned with a mad, triumphant light. "Impressive, Amos," he sneered. "Fighting for a house you don't even deserve to stand in." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Amos's heart. "Silas, wait." Ruth's voice cut through the tension. She stepped out from behind the overturned settee, holding up the silver locket so it caught the flickering lantern light. "This is what you really came for, isn't it? This and the ghost of a man named William." Silas froze, his eyes locking onto the locket. His composure cracked, his face twisting in a snarl of pure hatred. "That trinket belongs to a family of thieves who destroyed my father." "No," Ruth said, her voice shaking but clear. "It belonged to my husband. A good man. A farmer. A man you desecrated. This was never about your father's money. This is about you." "You know nothing," he screamed, his rage boiling over. "I know your sister feared you." Ruth pressed on, taking a step closer. "I know she begged you to let go of your hatred. And I know you were not in some far-off territory when she fell ill. You were here. Weren't you, Silas? The final piece of the puzzle, the one whispered to her by intuition and a mother's understanding of secrets, fell into place. Silas's face contorted, the lie he had built his entire vendetta on, finally crumbling. "I came to see her." He choked out the confession, tearing from him in a raw, ragged torrent. "I was on the run. I just wanted to see her one last time. I didn't know I was sick. It was just a cough, a fever. I didn't know I was carrying the plague with me." His gun hand trembled. "She made me promise not to tell Amos. She didn't want him to blame me. She didn't want the law to find me. She was protecting me. She died protecting me." He sobbed the sound, a terrible, broken thing. And he wasn't even here. His grief, twisted into a murderous rage, was finally laid bare. His entire campaign of revenge against Amos and Ruth's family was nothing but a monstrous lie he had told himself to escape, the crushing, unbearable guilt of knowing he had killed the one person he ever truly loved. The revelation shattered him. His carefully constructed world of righteous vengeance collapsed into a pathetic heap of self-loathing. He stared at Amos, at Ruth, his eyes vacant, his purpose gone. In that moment of stunned horror, he was no longer a predator. He was just a broken man, destroyed by his own darkness. Amos didn't fire. There was no need. The fight was over. As Silas stood emotionally gutted and exposed, the sounds of shouting and approaching horses became audible even over the din of the storm. Jed, in a moment of desperate brilliance, had slipped out a back window during the gunfight and ridden for help. The law had arrived. Silas's defeat was absolute, brought about not by a bullet, but by the devastating power of the truth. As the sandstorm's fury receded, a fragile quiet settled over Hollow Creek. The first thing Ruth noticed was the quality of the light, a pale, clean gray, filtering through the dust-caked windows, washing the chaos of the room in the gentle colors of dawn. The sheriff and his posse, alerted by a mud-spattered and exhausted Jed, had taken Silas and his surviving men into custody. Silas didn't resist. He went with them like a man in a trance, his soul already imprisoned by the truth. The air in the house was thick with the smell of gunpowder dust and spilled lamp oil, but beneath it, a sense of clarity was returning. Amos moved through the wreckage, his face grim, but his eyes clear of the guilt that had shadowed them for so long. He and Ruth worked together in a practiced, silent rhythm, tending to Jed's grazed arm, righting the overturned furniture, and sweeping up the shattered glass. Their wounds were minor bruises, scrapes, the deep ache of exhaustion, but they moved with the shared purpose of people reclaiming their home. Finally, Amos crossed to the kitchen and lifted the heavy trap door. "It's over," he called down, his voice gentle. "You can come up now." Two small heads appeared in the opening. Rose and Thomas climbed out, blinking in the dim light and their eyes wide as they took in the devastation. They didn't cry. They simply walked to Ruth and Amos and wrapped their arms around their legs, holding on tight. The family stood together for a long moment in the center of the ravaged room, a small, unbreakable island in the aftermath of the storm. Amos knelt, pulling Rose closer. "Your mama was a brave woman," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She loved you more than anything. She died protecting someone she loved even though he was lost. That's the truth of it. And her memory is a blessing, not a burden." He looked from his daughter to Ruth. "And now we have been blessed again." He was finally free, able to honor Martha's memory without being crushed by it, able to affirm their future with Ruth without betraying his past. Later that morning, they sat together at the kitchen table. The rising sun, finally breaking through the last of the storm clouds, streamed through the newly cleaned window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Ruth poured 4 mugs of milk, and they ate cold biscuits left over from the day before. It was the most peaceful meal they had ever shared. The silence wasn't empty or heavy. It was full of unspoken relief, of promises kept, of a new day beginning. The house had been broken, but the home was intact. A few months later, the ranch was thriving under a warm summer sun. The scars on the house had been mended, new glass in the windows, fresh planks in the door, and the land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The town, having learned the full story of Silas's treachery and Amos's quiet endurance, rallied behind the Cartwright family. Credit was restored, friendly nods were returned, and their place in the community was cemented not by legacy, but by respect. The wedding, when it happened, was as quiet and sturdy as the family itself, but the true union, the symbolic sealing of their new life, came a week later. Amos took Ruth by the hand and led her to the gentle slope behind the house, to the walnut tree, where a single weathered stone marked Martha's grave. The grass was green, and wildflowers bloomed at the base of the tree. Next to Martha's marker, Amos placed a new stone he had carved himself. It was simple and unadorned, bearing 2 names, *, William, and Clara Bennett **. He took Ruth's hand, his thumbs stroking her knuckles. This family, he said, his voice low and steady, was built on love and loss. All of it deserves to be remembered. All of it has a place here. Tears streamed down Ruth's face, not of sorrow, but of a profound, healing gratitude. In that single selfless act, Amos had done more than welcome her into his future. He had made a home for her past, gathering all the broken pieces of her life and giving them a place of honor. As they stood there, the children playing a short distance away, their laughter carrying on the breeze, a rider approached from the main road. He carried a single letter, postmarked from Elgin. Ruth opened it with a curious smile. It was from Clyde. Jacob's mother is well *, it read. *, the fever broke, and she is stronger every day. The boy speaks of you and your children often. He says you taught him that even in the dark there are good people. We are in your debt. Ruth handed the letter to Amos. He read it and smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. It was a final, gentle grace note, a reminder of the kindness that had first cracked the walls around their hearts, reinforcing the story's quiet, persistent theme of hope and renewal. They walked back to the house, hand in hand, the children running ahead to the porch. Amos, Ruth, Rose, and Thomas stood together, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by trial, and by a love strong enough to heal all wounds. They looked out at the rolling hills and the vast open sky, at the land that was now truly their home together.